Wind River Valley, Wyoming. Winter 1835. Jonas Fletcher's cabin stood at 8,000 feet, walls chinked with grass and clay, logs still wearing bark. The temperature inside matched the cold outside, within 3 feet of a roaring fire. By February, he had burned through 4 cords of wood each month, 3 times what it should have taken. His hands were raw from splitting, his back ached from hauling, and still the cold seeped through those walls like they were made of paper. Most trappers accepted this as the cost of mountain living. Jonas Fletcher did not. What he built over the following months, a simple 2-stage entry system that combined a slatted outer vestibule with a sealed inner door, would cut fuel consumption in half, keep bears from food stores, and spread across the high country as standard practice. They called it excessive. Then winter proved them wrong. The sun rose late in the Wind River Valley that November morning in 1834. Jonas Fletcher stood outside his cabin, examining frost patterns on the interior of his single window. Ice had formed on the inside glass, 3 feet from an active fire. He had built this cabin the way every trapper in the Rocky Mountains built them. Logs cut in late summer when sap still ran. Bark left on because stripping it seemed like wasted effort. Gaps between logs stuffed with whatever came to hand. Creek clay, dried moss, prairie grass twisted tight. Stone fireplace on the north wall where the ground was flattest. The entire structure raised in 3 weeks. He had been proud of his speed. By his first November, pride had turned to understanding. The cabin was failing. The unseasoned logs had shrunk as they dried. Gaps opened between them that no amount of chinking could permanently fill. The bark held moisture against the wood, encouraging rot and providing shelter for insects. The clay chinking cracked during the first hard freeze in October, then crumbled away in chunks. The moss dried out and fell from the gaps in handfuls. The grass-stuffed openings became highways for mice and cold air alike. But the worst problem was invisible at first. The cabin had no thermal buffer. The stone fireplace sat against the outer wall, radiating half its warmth uselessly to the exterior. The log walls themselves, though they appeared solid, acted as moderate heat conductors. On the coldest nights, Jonas watched frost creep across the inside surfaces despite keeping the fire roaring. He burned 4 cords of firewood each month that first winter. The work of cutting and hauling consumed entire days. His hands developed calluses over calluses. His shoulders ached constantly. And still, each morning began with rekindling a fire that had died during the night and waiting for the interior temperature to climb above freezing. Standard cabin construction had failed him, but Jonas did not yet understand why. He knew only that something fundamental was wrong with how he had built his shelter. The traditional methods everyone used, the methods that worked adequately in milder climates, were insufficient here at 8,000 feet, where summer days reached 90 degrees and winter nights dropped to 30 below zero. Other trappers in the valley faced similar struggles. Samuel Worth, whose claim sat 5 miles north, reported burning through 5 cords monthly. Peter Hawkins, 10 miles south, had abandoned his first cabin entirely after a brutal December and built a second structure closer to the tree line where firewood was easier to haul. Every trapper Jonas spoke with told the same story: constant cold, excessive fuel consumption, and the exhausting labor of trying to stay warm. The accepted wisdom was simple. Mountain winters were hard, and you survived them through sheer effort and endurance. Build a cabin quickly, cut firewood constantly, burn it freely. Accept discomfort as the price of living in beaver country. Jonas Fletcher was about to learn that wisdom and truth were not the same thing. The answer began arriving in pieces during the fall of 1835. A Swedish trapper named Niels Bergstrom stopped at Jonas's cabin while passing through the valley. Niels had trapped the mountains since the early 1820s, an old-timer who had survived everything the Rockies offered. He looked at Jonas's cabin with the practiced eye of someone who understood exactly what he was seeing. "You are cold here," Niels said. It was not a question. Jonas did not bother denying it. "Colder than I have ever been. Cannot determine why. Logs are tight mostly. Fire burns well." Niels walked around the structure, studying it from different angles. He pushed against logs, examined the chinking, noted how the fireplace was positioned. Finally, he shook his head. "Your cabin is built backwards. You have made the fire warm the ground outside instead of the floor inside. The cold lives in your walls instead of staying where it belongs, outside." Heat, Niels explained, moved in specific ways. It radiated from hot surfaces. It conducted through materials, faster through some than others. And it rose, which was why the ceiling area of any cabin stayed warmer than the floor. Every one of these heat movements worked against Jonas in his current structure. The fireplace radiated half its warmth to the exterior wall, which conducted that heat straight outside. Rising heat escaped through gaps near the roofline that Jonas had not sealed properly. The walls themselves conducted cold inward constantly. And the cabin had no interior mass to store warmth after the fire died down. Niels described cabins he had seen in the Rockies, built by trappers who had learned from their mistakes. They positioned fireplaces in the interior when possible, or at least built them with significant masses extending into the living space. They used double-wall construction in the coldest areas, 2 layers of logs with packed earth or sawdust between them. For insulation, they sealed every gap with proper chinking using materials that would not crack or fall out. But Niels mentioned one technique that caught Jonas's attention immediately. Some trappers, he said, built an outer vestibule, a small enclosed space before the main door. This created an air buffer that prevented cold wind from blasting directly into the cabin every time the door opened. It also provided storage space for items that needed protection from snow but did not require the warmth of the interior. Jonas listened carefully. He had already started planning his modifications. Everything Niels told him contradicted the standard wisdom he had followed before. But that standard wisdom had left him freezing and miserable. Winter was coming again. He had perhaps 6 weeks before the first major storms arrived. 6 weeks to implement what he was learning. The second piece of knowledge came from an unexpected source. That same autumn, a Shoshone woman named Morning Crow came through the valley with her husband, a French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste Marot. They stopped at Jonas's cabin to trade. Morning Crow took one look at his setup and laughed. "White men build cold houses," she said, in the mixture of Shoshone, French, and English that served as common language in the fur trade. "You make walls that breathe out warmth, like Old Man breathes out life." Jonas was growing tired of people telling him his cabin was inadequate, but he was smart enough to listen when someone who survived winters in this country offered advice. Morning Crow explained that her people did not build with logs the way white trappers did. When they constructed shelters meant to last through winter, they used what she called 2 skins, an inner wall and an outer wall with air or insulating material trapped between them. The principle was simple. Air itself was a reasonable insulator as long as it did not move. Trap air between 2 barriers and it could not carry heat away. But if you had only a single log wall, the air on both sides contacted the wood directly, allowing heat to transfer through constantly. Add a second barrier with trapped air between, and you dramatically reduced that heat transfer. She described how her people used bark, hides, or woven mats to create double-layer shelters. She explained how they sometimes dug lodges partially underground in the coldest regions, using the earth itself as insulation. And she mentioned something Jonas had not considered, that a structure could be designed to work with the seasons, staying warm in winter and cool in summer if you understood how the sun moved and how air flowed. In summer, you want hot air to leave. Make openings high where hot air goes. Make shade on sunny side. In winter, you close high openings. Make hot air stay inside. and you keep earth warmth beneath your floor, not let it go away outside. Jonas spent the rest of that autumn thinking about everything Niels and Morning Crow had told him. Heat moving in different ways, trapping air, positioning elements where their benefits stayed inside instead of escaping. Double barriers, seasonal adaptation. By December, he had worked out a specific plan. He could not rebuild his entire cabin before winter arrived. The walls would have to stand as they were, though he could improve the chinking significantly. But he could address the single greatest source of heat loss and cold infiltration: the door. Every time that door opened, warm air rushed out and cold air rushed in. The entry faced directly into the living space, with no buffer. This, Jonas realized, was where he would focus his effort. Jonas began gathering materials in mid-December of 1835. He needed pine boards for the inner door, thick planks that would seal tightly. He needed fir slats for the outer vestibule, wood that could withstand weather exposure without rapid decay. And he needed to work quickly because the major storms would arrive by late January. He cut pine from trees he had marked earlier in the fall. Each plank was hewn to 3 inches thick, using his draw knife, then shaped to precise dimensions. The door would measure 30 inches wide by 72 inches tall, large enough for easy passage, but not so large that its weight would stress the hinges. For the vestibule frame, he selected straight fir logs 8 inches in diameter. These would support the outer structure and bear the weight of snow accumulation on the vestibule roof. He cut them to length, stripped the bark, and allowed them to dry for 2 weeks while he worked on other components. The critical element was the slatted outer wall of the vestibule. Jonas designed it with specific parameters. The slats would run vertically, spaced 3 inches apart center to center. Each slat measured 1 1/2 inches wide. This meant the gap between slats was approximately 1 1/2 inches, wide enough for air circulation but too narrow for snow to blow through horizontally. The vertical orientation ensured snow would fall between the slats rather than accumulating against a solid surface. He calculated that 12 slats would be required for each of the 3 outer walls of the vestibule, 36 slats total. Each one needed to be uniform in width and smoothly finished to prevent splintering. The work consumed 2 weeks. Standard cabin construction involved no such precision. Doors were built from whatever boards were available, hung on leather hinges or wooden pegs, and sealed with a simple wooden bar. The entire process took perhaps a day. Jonas's door and vestibule system represented a week's careful labor for each component. Other trappers who passed by during construction questioned his methods. William Crawford, whose claim adjoined Jonas's to the south, stopped to examine the work. "You are building a fort or a house?" Crawford asked. "A house," Jonas replied. "Seems like you are planning for an army to attack instead of just winter." "Winter can be an army." Crawford shook his head. "My cabin was done in 3 weeks. Cost me $18 total. You have been at this 2 months and spent what, $100 more? First snow might come while you are still working." "Then I will finish in cold weather," Jonas said. Crawford rode away, convinced Jonas was wasting effort and resources. The story spread through the scattered trapping community. That Norwegian fellow building the elaborate door system, spending weeks on what should take days, too cautious for frontier life. Jonas ignored the commentary and kept working. He understood something the others did not yet comprehend. Frontier survival was not about speed. It was about building right the first time. The door installation occurred during the first week of January, 1836. Jonas mounted the inner door using iron hinges he had purchased in St. Louis the previous summer. These hinges were mortised into both the door and the log frame. The hinges sat in rectangular pockets cut into the wood, then were secured with iron pins driven through the logs. To remove these hinges, you would have to destroy the logs themselves. The door was sealed with a heavy wooden bar that dropped into iron brackets on the interior. Jonas added a secondary system, a horizontal beam that slid through brackets mounted to the door and into a mortise cut into the adjacent wall log. When engaged, this beam connected the door directly to the wall structure, making the assembly nearly impossible to force from outside. The outer vestibule went up around this door in 3 days. The fir posts were set 18 inches deep in the frozen ground and braced at the corners. The slatted walls were attached to a framework of smaller poles, each slat positioned precisely according to Jonas's specifications. The roof was simple, split pine shakes laid over poles, with a slight pitch to shed water and snow away from the cabin wall. The completed system created a small space approximately 4 feet deep by 5 feet wide, large enough to store firewood, tools, and meat out of the weather, but not requiring interior heat, small enough that its construction did not require excessive materials or labor. Jonas tested the system immediately. He opened the inner door, entered the vestibule, closed the inner door behind him, then opened the outer slatted wall and stepped outside. When he reversed the process coming in, he noticed the temperature difference immediately. The vestibule space was cold, certainly, perhaps 10 degrees warmer than the outside air, but far colder than the cabin interior. Yet when he opened the inner door, after passing through the vestibule, the rush of warm air escaping from the cabin was dramatically reduced compared to his previous single-door arrangement. The principle was working. The vestibule created a pressure buffer zone. Cold air entering through the slatted outer wall mixed with slightly warmer air in the EOS vestibule space. When the inner door opened, this intermediate temperature air entered the cabin rather than the full blast of outside cold. The temperature gradient was distributed across 2 barriers instead of 1, but the true test would come during the first major storm. Jonas did not have to wait long. On January 15th, a blizzard moved into the Wind River Valley. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero. Wind reached 40 miles per hour. Snow fell continuously for 3 days, accumulating to 4 feet on level ground. Jonas remained inside his cabin for the duration of the storm. He opened the inner door twice daily to retrieve firewood from the vestibule. Each time he noted the reduced heat loss. The vestibule space was packed with snow that had sifted through the slats, but the snow was dry and powdery, easily brushed aside. None had penetrated to the inner door. Inside the cabin, the temperature held steady at approximately 45 degrees Fahrenheit near the floor, 55 degrees at chest height. The fireplace burned efficiently, its heat retained by the improved chinking Jonas had completed in December and now protected from the constant influx of cold air his previous door arrangement had allowed. When the blizzard cleared on January 18th, Jonas conducted a careful accounting. He had burned through 1 1/2 cords of firewood during the 3-day storm. The previous January, during a storm of comparable severity and duration, he had burned through 3 cords, maintaining barely adequate interior temperatures. The fuel savings were extraordinary. Jonas marked his observations in a small ledger he kept for tracking supplies. The entry for January 18th, 1836, read, "Storm 3 days, temp 30 below, used 1.5 cord, previous year 3 cord, door system holds heat." This was not subjective comfort. This was measurable reduction in the most critical resource for winter survival: firewood. Every cord Jonas did not burn represented roughly 8 hours of labor saved. Cutting, limbing, hauling, splitting, stacking, the work of firewood procurement consumed enormous time and physical effort. Reducing fuel consumption by half meant reducing that labor by half. Word began spreading through the valley. William Crawford stopped by in early February, no longer skeptical. His own cabin had consumed 4 cords during the same storm. His wife had suffered from the constant cold despite maintaining the fire around the clock. Crawford examined Jonas's vestibule system carefully, noting the slat spacing, the inner door construction, the overall design. "I called you excessive," Crawford said. "I was wrong." Other trappers visited over the following weeks. Peter Hawkins, Samuel Worth, a French-Canadian named Remy Toussaint, each examined the system and asked questions. How wide were the slats? What spacing prevented snow infiltration? How deep should the vestibule extend? Could the EDA system work with existing cabin doors, or did it require complete reconstruction? Jonas answered every question patiently. He had not built the system to keep secrets. He had built it to survive, and if others could benefit from what he had learned, that was acceptable. By March, 2 other trappers in the valley had built similar vestibule systems. Remy Toussaint constructed one that extended 6 feet from his cabin wall, creating enough space to store an entire cord of firewood under cover. Samuel Worth built a simplified version using smaller slat spacing, 2 inches apart rather than 3, which prevented even fine snow from penetrating but required more materials. The variations did not concern Jonas. The principle was sound. Create an air buffer zone that moderated temperature transfer and prevented direct cold air infiltration into the living space. The specific implementation could adapt to individual needs and available materials. What mattered was that the method worked, measurably, quantifiably, undeniably. Men who built vestibule systems used less firewood. Their cabins stayed warmer. Their winter survival required less constant labor. The frontier was learning that sometimes excessive caution was actually necessary preparation. Spring arrived in the Wind River Valley during April of 1836. As temperatures warmed and snow melted, grizzly bears emerged from hibernation. Hungry, irritable, and drawn to any scent of food, they posed a serious threat to trappers and their supplies. Jonas returned to his cabin one afternoon in late April to find tracks circling his structure. A large grizzly, probably male based on the print size, had visited while he was checking trap lines. The bear had investigated the vestibule thoroughly. Claw marks scored the fur slats. The animal had tested them, pulling and pushing, attempting to determine if the barrier would yield. But the slats, each one secured to the frame poles with hand-forged nails, had held. The spacing prevented the bear from reaching through to the inner door. The vertical orientation meant the bear could not gain leverage to tear individual slats free. Most significantly, the vestibule design made the inner door invisible to the bear. From outside, the bear encountered only a slatted barrier that offered no obvious entry point. The solid door behind was protected from direct assault. Standard cabins presented their doors directly to any approaching bear. The door was the weakest point in the structure. Hinges could be torn free, frames could be splintered, bars could be forced. Bears learned through experience that attacking doors often yielded access to food stored inside. Jonas's vestibule eliminated that learned behavior. The bear found no door to attack. It found only a slatted barrier that did not respond to force in the way solid doors responded. After approximately 20 minutes of investigation, Jonas could read the story in the tracks and disturbed ground the bear had departed. This was the unexpected secondary benefit of the 2-stage entry system. Jonas had designed it to reduce heat loss and prevent cold air infiltration. But the slatted outer vestibule also functioned as a predator deterrent, protecting stored meat and other food supplies from bear intrusion. The bear returned twice more during late April and early May. Each visit showed the same pattern: investigation of the slats, testing for weakness, eventual departure. The vestibule remained intact, the inner door remained untouched. Jonas's meat stores remained secure. Other trappers were not as fortunate. Samuel Worth lost a winter's worth of preserved meat when a grizzly broke through his cabin door in early May. The bear destroyed the interior, shredded bedding, scattered supplies. Worth escaped injury only because he happened to be outside when the break-in occurred. After that incident, Worth visited Jonas's cabin to study the vestibule system once more. He paid particular attention to the slat construction and how it confused the bear's attack patterns. "You built this for cold," Worth said, "but it stops bears too." "Yes," Jonas replied. "I had not anticipated that benefit, but I am grateful for it." Worth rebuilt his own cabin entry the following week, incorporating a vestibule system. Other trappers did the same. By summer of 1836, 5 cabins in the Wind River Valley featured 2-stage entry systems. All 5 reported reduced fuel consumption during the following winter. None reported successful bear intrusions. The spread of Jonas's 2-stage door system followed the informal networks that connected mountain communities. Trappers traveling between valleys carried descriptions of the design. Some made rough sketches on birch bark or in the margins of ledger books. Others simply memorized the key specifications, slat width, spacing, vestibule depth, and shared them verbally at trading posts and rendezvous gatherings. By 1838, variations of the system appeared throughout the northern Rockies. A group of trappers who had wintered in the Wind River Valley in 1837 built cabins in Montana Territory incorporating vestibule entries. Settlers heading west stopped in the valley and received advice on cabin construction from Jonas and others. The knowledge dispersed gradually but steadily. The techniques continued adapting to different environments and materials. In regions where fir was scarce, builders used lodgepole pine or cottonwood for slats. Where winter winds came from different directions, vestibules were positioned accordingly. Some builders added hinged panels to the slatted walls, allowing them to be sealed completely during the most severe storms while remaining open for ventilation during milder weather. An older trapper named Martin Samuels built a vestibule system with 6-inch wide slats spaced 6 inches apart. His reasoning was that larger openings would reduce snow accumulation within the vestibule space while still providing an air buffer. The design worked, though it was less effective at preventing fine snow infiltration during high winds. A French-Canadian named Jacques Moreau built what he called a double vestibule, 2 separate slatted chambers in sequence before the inner door. This created 2 air buffer zones rather than 1. Moreau reported even greater heat retention than the standard single vestibule, but the construction required significantly more materials and labor. Few others adopted the double system, though those who did praised its effectiveness. The documented spread of the technique demonstrates how frontier innovation moved through personal networks rather than formal publication. No manual existed explaining the 2-stage door system. No blueprint was filed with any territorial office. Yet, by the early 1840s, the basic concept was known throughout the Rocky Mountain trapping community. Anthropologist Margaret Walsh, studying frontier building practices in the 1930s, interviewed descendants of mountain men who had trapped during the 1830s and 40s. Several mentioned the Fletcher door, or vestibule entry, as standard practice in high-altitude cabins. Walsh noted that the technique had largely disappeared by the 1890s, replaced by manufactured doors and insulated construction materials. But during the trapping era, it represented a significant survival advantage in extreme cold climates. The economic impact was real, though never formally calculated. If a typical mountain cabin required 4 cords of firewood monthly during a 6-month winter season, 24 cords total, and the vestibule system reduced consumption to 12 cords, that represented 12 cords of labor saved. At roughly 8 hours of work per cord, the system saved 96 hours of dangerous, exhausting labor. For a trapper whose time had direct economic value in pelts harvested, this was substantial. The social impact was equally significant. Cabins that remained warmer with less fuel meant better health outcomes. Families could spend time on activities beyond constant woodcutting. The knowledge that proper construction could dramatically improve survival gave settlers confidence to remain in harsh climates rather than abandoning claims after difficult winters. February 1843 brought the decisive test of Jonas Fletcher's design principles. A storm system stalled over the Wind River Valley for 5 days, dropping snow continuously. When it finally cleared on February 23rd, snow depth on level ground measured 42 inches. Drifts against north-facing structures reached 8 feet. The temperature during the storm never rose above 15 below zero. Wind sustained at 30 miles per hour with gusts to 50. These were conditions that killed inadequately prepared settlers and destroyed poorly built structures. Jonas, now 54 years old and married with 3 children, weathered the storm in the cabin he had improved continuously since 1835. The 2-stage door system, rebuilt and reinforced multiple times over the years, performed exactly as designed. The vestibule space filled completely with snow that had sifted through the slats, but that snow acted as additional insulation rather than a problem. The dry, powdery accumulation was easily removed when Jonas opened the inner door to retrieve firewood. Interior temperature during the storm held at 42 degrees near the floor, 50 degrees at chest height. The family remained comfortable. Food stores stayed accessible. The cabin consumed 1 3/4 cords of firewood over the 5-day period. William Crawford, whose cabin sat 1 mile south, did not fare as well. He had never rebuilt his entry system despite witnessing Jonas's success years earlier. During the storm, his single door arrangement allowed constant cold infiltration. He burned through 4 cords of firewood and still could not maintain adequate warmth. His wife and 2 children huddled by the fireplace, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. When the storm cleared, Crawford walked to Jonas's cabin. He found the family eating a warm meal, the interior comfortable, children playing rather than shivering. The contrast was undeniable. "I should have built it your way," Crawford said. "I have regretted that decision every winter since." Other settlers and trappers throughout the valley faced similar outcomes. Those who had incorporated proper vestibule systems and improved insulation survived the storm with relative comfort. Those who had built quickly and inadequately suffered terribly. 2 families abandoned their claims within weeks of the storm, unable to face the prospect of another such winter. The storm of 1843 became a reference point in the valley's history. People spoke of events as occurring before the big snow or after the 43 storm. It marked a clear division between those who built for survival and those who built for speed. By spring of 1843, 7 additional cabins in the Wind River Valley were being rebuilt or extensively modified to include 2-stage entry systems. The technique that Jonas had developed nearly a decade earlier was no longer an eccentric experiment. It was recognized necessity. The numbers told the story more effectively than any argument. Proper vestibule systems cut fuel consumption by 40 to 50% during severe weather. In a climate where firewood procurement determined survival, that difference was everything. Jonas Fletcher proved up his homestead claim in July of 1845, gaining full ownership of his 160 acres. The claim filing noted substantial improvements, including dwelling, barn, and cultivated acreage. The dwelling referenced was the cabin he had been improving for a decade. By 1845, the cabin was no longer an experiment. It was a proven system. Double-wall construction on the north and west sides provided substantial insulation. The massive interior stone fireplace served as thermal battery, storing heat and releasing it slowly. The 2-stage door system protected the entry. Every gap was carefully chinked and regularly maintained. The structure represented accumulated knowledge translated into functional architecture. Other settlers filing claims in the valley that year built with Jonas's principles in mind from the start. The distinction between fast construction and correct construction was now well understood. New cabins incorporated vestibule entries as standard features. Some builders hired Jonas as a consultant, paying him in trade goods or labor to review their plans and suggest improvements. The broader context of frontier settlement was changing. The fur trade had collapsed by the mid-1840s as beaver populations declined and fashion shifted away from felt hats. But settlers continued moving west, establishing permanent homesteads in regions that had previously supported only temporary trapping camps. These settlers needed structures that would last decades, not just survive a single trapping season. The building techniques developed by mountain men like Jonas Fletcher provided the foundation for more permanent settlement architecture. The two-stage entry system translated easily to barn doors, root cellar entries, and smokehouse construction. Any structure that needed to maintain interior temperature while allowing human access benefited from the principle of the air buffer zone. Indigenous building practices contributed to this knowledge base as well. Shoshone, Crow, and other tribes had developed sophisticated cold-climate shelter designs over centuries. Mourning Crow's explanation of the two skins principle had directly influenced Jonas's thinking. Other trappers learned from lodges that used earth berming, from structures that oriented doors away from prevailing winds, from insulation techniques using natural materials. The synthesis of these different knowledge traditions, European log building, indigenous architecture, and practical frontier experimentation, created building methods suited to the specific challenges of the Rocky Mountain environment. No single person invented these techniques. Rather, they emerged from the collective experience of many people facing similar problems and sharing solutions. By 1850, the Wind River Valley supported approximately 30 permanent homesteads. 23 of these structures incorporated some version of a two-stage entry system. The technique had become standard practice, unremarkable in its ubiquity. This was success, not innovation celebrated as revolutionary, but innovation adopted so completely that it became invisible through integration into common knowledge. Spring of 1845 brought renewed testing of the vestibule system's secondary function as predator barrier. A particularly aggressive grizzly, estimated at over 500 pounds based on track size, ranged through the valley that season. The bear had learned that human settlements often meant accessible food. The grizzly attacked multiple cabins during April and May. At the Morrison Homestead, 3 miles east of Jonas's claim, the bear destroyed a poorly constructed door and ransacked food stores. At the Wheaton Place, 4 miles south, the animal tore apart an outdoor smokehouse and consumed a season's worth of preserved meat. Settlers began organizing hunting parties to eliminate the threat. Jonas's cabin faced its test on May 7th. The bear arrived in late afternoon while Jonas was working in his small garden plot 60 yards from the cabin. His wife and children were inside. The grizzly approached the vestibule, drawn by the scent of smoked venison hanging within. The bear investigated the slatted wall methodically. It pushed against the slats, testing for weakness. It clawed at the wood, leaving deep gouges. It attempted to reach through the gaps to the inner door beyond. The slats held. The spacing prevented the bear from gaining purchase. The vertical orientation prevented leverage that might have torn individual pieces free. After approximately 15 minutes of effort, the bear gave up and moved away. Jonas, who had remained still during the encounter to avoid drawing the animal's attention, waited until the grizzly was well clear before approaching the cabin. The vestibule showed damage. The cottonwood slats bore claw marks and bite impressions, but the structure remained intact. The inner door was untouched. The food stores were secure. The slats damaged during this encounter were saved when Jonas eventually replaced them. They provide physical documentation of the predator deterrence function of the two-stage entry system. The tooth marks, still visible, show where the bear bit down on wood approximately 1 1/2 inches wide, unable to grip effectively or tear the slat free from its mounting. The grizzly was eventually killed by a hunting party in June after attacking livestock at a settlement 10 miles north. But the incident at Jonas's cabin demonstrated conclusively that proper vestibule construction could withstand even determined assault by the region's apex predator. This protection was not incidental. Food security was survival security on the frontier. Losing a season's preserved meat could mean starvation during the following winter. The ability to store food safely within or adjacent to the dwelling, protected by architecture rather than constant vigilance, was a significant survival advantage. Federal surveyors mapping Wyoming territory in 1853 documented settlement patterns and construction methods in their official notes. The survey of Township 33 North, Range 104 West, which included the Wind River Valley, noted that dwellings in this district typically feature double-entry systems or covered vestibules to manage severe winter conditions. This bureaucratic observation recorded what had become standard practice. The two-stage door was no longer an innovation worthy of special mention. It was simply how structures were built in high-altitude, severe climate regions. The survey notes provide historical documentation of the technique's complete integration into frontier building practices within 2 decades of Jonas Fletcher's original construction. The knowledge had spread, been tested, proven effective, and become sufficiently common that federal surveyors noted it as typical rather than exceptional. By the mid-1850s, Jonas was in his 60s, still living in the cabin he had built and continuously improved. His children were grown. 2 had moved to Oregon. 1 remained in the valley, establishing his own homestead 3 miles from his father's claim. That son built his cabin with a vestibule system from the beginning based on his father's design but incorporating modifications of his own devising. The techniques continued evolving. Some builders created vestibules with solid sidewalls and slatted outer walls only. Others built completely enclosed outer chambers with doors at both ends, sacrificing some ventilation for maximum wind protection. A few experimented with adjustable slat systems that could be opened wider in summer for increased airflow and narrowed in winter for maximum protection. Settlers arriving in the valley in the late 1850s found a mature building tradition. New homesteaders could learn from established settlers rather than repeating the mistakes of the earliest arrivals. The accumulated knowledge of proper construction for mountain conditions was freely shared, passed from experienced settlers to newcomers as standard information rather than proprietary secret. This knowledge transmission represents a crucial but often overlooked aspect of frontier settlement. Success did not require that every settler personally discover optimal building methods through trial and error. Success required that those who learned effective techniques shared them with others. The frontier sorted people, certainly, but it also educated survivors who were then able to educate newcomers. Jonas Fletcher's contribution was not that he invented a technique from whole cloth. Double-entry systems existed in various forms in cold climates worldwide. His contribution was synthesizing knowledge from multiple sources: Swedish construction principles, Shoshone insulation concepts, personal observation of heat movement, into a specific design suited to Rocky Mountain conditions, then sharing that design freely so others could benefit. The document that best captures this generous approach is a letter Jonas wrote in 1856 to his son in Oregon, which included detailed drawings and specifications for building a vestibule entry. The letter concluded, "Build it careful, and it will serve you well. The time spent in proper construction repays itself many winters over." Jonas Fletcher died in the winter of 1867 at age 78. He was buried on a hillside above his cabin, overlooking the valley where he had lived for 33 years. The cabin he built stood for another 20 years before being dismantled when his grandson constructed a larger house on the same site. The two-stage door system, carefully maintained through decades of use, was preserved and installed on a barn built in 1889. The inner door, solid pine with iron hardware, remained functional after 53 years. The outer vestibule slats were replaced multiple times over the decades, but the framework and design remained unchanged. By the 1890s, manufactured doors and improved insulation materials were becoming available even in remote territories. The necessity that had driven Jonas Fletcher's original innovation was diminishing. Settlers could purchase factory-made storm doors. They could order insulated panels. The two-stage vestibule system gradually disappeared, replaced by products of industrial manufacturing. But during the decades when survival depended on individual resourcefulness and accumulated frontier knowledge, the technique had mattered enormously. It had reduced fuel consumption by half in some cases. It had protected food stores from predators. It had made brutal winters survivable rather than merely endurable. The technique's disappearance from common practice does not diminish its historical significance. It represents a moment when settlers recognized that frontier survival required more than speed and endurance. It required understanding of fundamental principles, heat transfer, air pressure, structural integrity, and willingness to invest time in construction that worked with natural forces rather than simply resisting them. 3 of the original stone foundation blocks from Jonas Fletcher's cabin are preserved at the Wyoming State Museum in Cheyenne. They bear no inscription, no identification of their origin. They are simply examples of frontier construction, cut and fitted by hand in the 1830s. But they represent the methodical approach that characterized Jonas's work. Foundation stones placed deliberately, logs selected carefully, techniques borrowed from multiple traditions, time invested to ensure lasting function. The two-stage door beat wind, snow, and bears because it was built on understanding rather than tradition, on observation rather than assumption. Jonas Fletcher did not set out to revolutionize cabin construction. He set out to survive the winter. That the method he developed spread across the high country and saved fuel, labor, and lives was consequence rather than goal. The principle endures even as the specific technique fades from practice. Preparation matters more than speed. Understanding matters more than tradition and proper construction. The first time repays itself in countless winters that follow.